If you have ever returned to work for a job that you really love and care about after having a baby, you are really going to relate to this episode with Gina Mundy. If you had a close friend or family member who you felt really comfortable with and who was able to guide you and teach you while breastfeeding, you're going to love this episode. If you have ever struggled to find time to pump at work or had a stressful position which definitely had an impact on your milk supply, you are going to love this episode. There is so much crammed into this episode with my guest, Gina Mundy. I can't wait for you to hear it. Hi, Gina. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm so glad you're here.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited for today's conversation.
Yes, me too. So before we get into your own stories, I would love for you to introduce yourself and your family and the work.
Oh, sure. So I am a mom and I have three kids. My oldest is 19. My middle child is 15. Both of my older ones are girls. My older kids are girls. And then my youngest child is my son, and he's 9. So I
Okay.
live in, yeah, I know it's like the working mom gap is
Right,
what I call it. So as they started to go more independent, get into kindergarten, I'm like, all right, let's have another baby.
right.
Um, so yeah, so I live in Michigan with my family. I've been married for 21 years. And then I've also been a childbirth attorney for 21 years. So that's an attorney that specializes in childbirth cases. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, yeah. And you have some interesting work, and you've been sharing this work in a variety of ways. I heard you say somewhere that you kind of just fell into being a childbirth attorney.
That was it. I wish I had a more interesting story. I was the very first podcast and they were like, "How'd you get into this?" I'm like, "It's my first job out of law school." But as I just said, I have been married the same amount of time I've been a childbirth attorney. So
Mm,
having a baby was on my radar. So when I was hired into a team of 20 people, and that's over 20 people, and that's all they did were childbirth cases, it was very alarming because, just so your audience understands, those are cases involving the birth of a baby when something goes wrong, whether
mhm.
it's a mistake, it's a complication. Baby is not born healthy. Baby may pass away during childbirth, or sometimes mom passes away. So I wanted to have a baby. It was on my radar. I just gotten married, and I get into this childbirth world that I had never heard of and I had no idea existed. And to this day, people still ask me, like, what do you do?
Mm.
Because it's not well known what we do unless you're one of the unfortunate families that has to meet me after the birth of your baby.
Yeah, and so you started that line of work before you yourself were a parent.
I did. I
Okay.
did.
Yeah.
So it's pretty
So
interesting.
yeah, that is interesting. And so we are going to focus in on some of that work and the lessons you've learned and how people can think about those lessons and how to incorporate them into their own planning for childbirth. But before we do that, I want to dive in a little bit, as we do with most of our guests, to your own baby feeding stories, which is so interrelated to birth. Um, and I want to take you way back to your childhood and
Mm.
have you think about your exposure to baby feeding from your earliest memories. What do you remember seeing?
Oh, everybody breastfeeding with a blanket or towel over them. That was my
Mm,
family, at least. Everybody
mm.
was, they would interact. I always had a harder time with this. When I breastfed, I always had to go in a separate room. But my early childhood memories, maybe it's just because everybody had way more kids than me at one time, so they couldn't just leave the room to breastfeed.
Mm.
But my early memories are blankets, everybody just walking around breastfeeding in my family. I
Okay,
have a
so
pretty big family, aunts and
okay.
uncles, and we're tight.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you do remember seeing people breastfeeding as not maybe not their breasts or anything, but the act of breastfeeding.
Yeah.
Um, because most people, when we ask that question, they might say, "Oh, yeah, I know my mom breastfed, or I had an aunt that breastfed, but I didn't really see it." that much. But in your memory as a child, you do have memories of people feeding babies from their bodies.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, but
Okay.
my family, we're tight. My mom has there's 5 of them together. They all had their kids together. We had a family business, so they all worked together.
Mm.
So we were together all the time, and everyone had loved to have babies. So it was, for me, maybe a little bit different, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And did you play with baby dolls as a young girl?
Of course I did. I played with baby dolls, and then I dreamed of the day that I would, the big day when I would have my baby and
Ye
what she would look like and all that
Okay.
stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, and do you remember ever feeding the baby? Did you do pretend play, imaginative play with the baby breastfeeding, or was it always with a bottle?
Oh, I always did it with a bottle.
Okay.
We
Yeah.
had our baby bottles and we had our babies. Oh, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's pretty interesting, that even though you were so exposed to breastfeeding, that for you, in your little girl mind, the way that a baby fed was still with a bottle, even though biologically feeding babies from bodies is the norm.
Right. Well, maybe, I mean, some babies, when you got them, the baby dolls, they would have the bottle with it, the
Right.
baby, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
maybe just instinctively, I'm like, "Oh, baby bottle,
Right.
practice." But
Right.
yeah, you know what? I never thought about that. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah,
Good
it's one
point.
of the cultural, themes that I see coming up again and again because we feel most comfortable with what we practice. And imaginative play is practicing for being a grown up. And if your default as a young child is that babies feed from bottles, then that puts more distance between breastfeeding and makes it more challenging once you're actually doing it.
Oh,
It's a working
interesting.
theory I have that this, disconnect from our imaginative play in childhood to what actually happens when we grow up and how that impacts our experiences.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, I know, isn't that
That is
interesting?
fascinating. Even I would wanna know that for my grandkids, my kids.
Mhm.
That is a gr I'm like, "Wow." I'm like, "I've never put this together."
I know,
Yeah,
right?
no,
Isn't that
that's
interesting?
amazing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But you did have that early exposure at least. Did you know at the time what those babies were doing under the blankets?
Yes.
Okay. So that was clear to you, even though you
Yeah, I
weren't.
did know that.
Okay,
Mhm.
very good. Okay, so then you become a lawyer. There's a lot of things in between being a child playing with dolls and becoming a lawyer, I'm sure. But you become a lawyer. Your first job out of law school is these baby birth cases where they were challenging births and they end in injury or death of the child and trying to figure out if there is fault that can be placed on the care team. Am I describing that properly?
Perfect.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. And you did not have a child yourself. So, those of us who it y I hear this all the time from people who have the opportunity to see kind of traumatic um, or or scary, I'll use that word, births, then I can see that that always shifts the decisions that they make, almost always, as people themselves becoming parents. And so, what impact as you were getting into your practice and then becoming a parent, when you were pregnant, what impact did your work have on your own psyche and the decisions that you were making? Because you weren't the I can imagine that now that you've had this 21 years of experience, you have been able to glean more concise lessons than maybe when you were first starting out and also becoming a parent. So at that time, what were you thinking about how you wanted to handle your birth experience given what you did for work?
Right. So this is actually in the book, which I know we didn't talk about at the beginning, but just so your audience knows, I did write a book based upon
Yes.
my experience called A Parent's Guide to a Safer Childbirth. But I even mentioned this in the book. As baby lawyers, we we tend to want elective C-sections. The problem was that in 2004, when I had my first baby, elective C-sections were still controversial. I'm talking about the elective C-section at 39 weeks. Now, my girlfriends were pregnant and they were also baby lawyers. So they would tell their doctors that they had herpes because back then, if you had herpes, you got your elective C-section at 39 weeks. I literally have this in the book. And
Wow.
it's because, like you just said, I mean, I cannot unsee what I've seen, unknow what I know. So for somebody like me to be able to relax and go into labor and have a baby was, I mean, the chances of it were slim to none. So I would talk to my OBGYN about it. And he was like, Gina, you're fine. You're going to be fine. You're going to have the baby naturally. It's going to be okay. You know, he just kept telling me, don't worry, I'll be there, you know, whatever. And it was, but he, so he would not schedule me for my elective 39-week C-section. Now I could have gotten a different doctor or something or told him I had herpes, but I didn't want to go that route. So what happened is early in the morning, I woke up in hard labor. I mean, my contractions were so strong. All I wanted to do was push a baby out. I mean, it was very odd. So we go to the hospital as fast as we can. I mean, I'm breathing through my contractions at this point. So the doctor, I get into my room, doctor comes in and, you know, they're so strong. I'm like, I need an epidural. Oh my goodness. I don't even want to be in labor, but I am. And they're like, don't worry, you got this. And then the baby's heart rate drops a couple times and I'm just not relaxing. And they were like, C-section. And that was it.
Mm,
So, you
mhm.
know, it's like, but I'll tell you, my mental psyche, I was so just, again, it's what I've seen. Most people don't know what I know. So, based upon what I had seen, even at that point in time, was still just was very scary to me. So, I think that my mental psyche was C section. And that is ultimately why I did have one. And then from that point on, I had elective C sections because obviously, after you have one C-section, completely okay to have an elective C-section at 39 weeks. Now, those guidelines have changed. And if you want an elective C-section at 39 weeks, you don't have to tell your doctor you have herpes.
Right, exactly. That's an important change. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I wanna follow up a little bit on what you said, but before we get into that, can you tell me what you were thinking about baby feeding in particular as a pregnant person?
I know. I mean, I'd known and that, breastfeeding was definitely the best route for baby. So, yeah, I mean, the whole time I was like, breastfeeding, it's going to be great. I'll do breastfeeding. So that
Mhm.
was definitely what I was across the board with all my kids. Same thing.
Yeah. And did you, do any preparation, learn anything about breastfeeding in advance, or did you take the approach that you were just going to figure it out as you went?
Yeah, I'm telling you, I did not prepare and I wish I would have.
Mm,
Now, this is 19, actually almost 20 years ago. She's going to be 20 in like 2 months.
wow.
So, yeah, 20 years ago, we did not have amazing podcasts like yours. But if I
Right.
would have had access to something like you are doing to help moms, then no, I love knowledge. Knowledge is power. Everything goes better when you have an understanding of what you're getting yourself into. So, yes, if I had your podcast, I 100% would have listened and I would have probably been more successful at the beginning because at the beginning it was very difficult for me.
Yeah. I hear people say this a lot, even people who have given birth really recently, and they get really taken aback by how difficult the very initial postpartum experience can be. And this is one of the things I wanted to dive in with you about when it comes to your book and the work you do, because as a doula and a childbirth educator, I find it very important to inform yourself about the birth, but we can't stop there. We have to help ourselves to prepare and
Mhm.
feel supported in that early postpartum period, because the work starts at the birth, but it doesn't end at the birth. You have a lot of recovery to do, and whatever happens in the birth has a huge impact on how good you feel in the postpartum period. The way your care providers treat you
Mhm.
and listen to you has a huge impact on how it doesn't matter how the birth turned out. What matters is how you felt while making the decisions during the birth. And I know that's kind of what your book is about too, is setting people up to understand what to look for and to have common language with their care providers so
Mhm.
that when they're making decisions, they feel well informed enough to do so. They know the right questions to ask, they know the right stats to look at. So, so in that time when you were just expecting to breastfeed, I never really put the onus on the person. It should be the care providers who are guiding them about what they should be learning about. But when it comes to baby feeding specifically, our doctors, our nurses, our midwives get a few hours of training when it comes to baby feeding in med school and throughout their midwifery training and their nursing school. So they don't even know what they don't know when it comes to preparation. So they don't know how to guide that pregnant person to making the decisions that are going to set themselves up for success.
You know, it's crazy, and that's such an important part of having a baby, especially if you're I mean, that's their nutrients, that's
Mhm.
their food that allows them to grow and develop. So, yeah, the fact that it's just a few hours of training is mind-blowing.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, so then you have this delivery. It ended with C-section, which is what you wanted to begin with. You just wished you could have elected it. Um, do you have any memories of the first latch with any of your children, or what the very initial baby feeding was like?
So, the first one, my oldest daughter, Abby, was very she would not latch, it was hard. And
Mm,
then I had, like, the new nipples, so it was like, oh, they were just once she did, it was like, "Ah!" They weren't used to it at all, the first baby, so eventually she did, eventually we got it, but
mm,
no, she took some time, and luckily, I have an amazing sister, she should have been a doula, but she's not, but she should be,
mhm.
and um she really would come over and help and work with the baby or, she'd be at the hospital, whatever, just making sure that everything was going okay.
Great. So when you had those initial latches, that were hurting so much and the baby wasn't really latching, what were the interventions that were being suggested or offered to help you figure that out?
I you know what? I don't know. She was always over just pushing my nipple into the baby's mouth. I don't know.
Your
Like,
your
"No,
sister?
Gina, this," or "No, Gina, that." It was
Mhm,
constantly, "Gina like this, Gina like that." I just remember I'm like, "Okay." At that point, let's see, she had 3 no. 2? No, she had all her kids before me, before mine. Well, she has 5, but she had the first 3 before. So, she just and then she would tend when somebody would have a baby, like my other sister, she would run to help them. No, she was just there, and then once the baby latched and everything else, and, then she was always giving me, like, some creams or whatever to put on when the baby wasn't attached, so
mhm. And were you getting any help from your care providers to help you solve the latching difficulties?
So when because I was in the hospital for a couple of days because it was a C-section, they did send somebody to help me.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm not sure, I can't it's so long ago, I'm not sure
Yeah.
if she really helped. I just remember my sister because my sister is a very direct
Mm,
person.
mm,
So I just remember her being like, "No, this way, hold like this, do this, wait this,"
mm,
whatever
mhm.
she was doing at that point in time. So it was more her. If the other one helped, I don't remember.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is another interesting cultural shift. I'm an international board certified lactation consultant. That's my primary role in the childbirth world, so
Mhm.
an IBCLC. And my profession has only really existed since I can't remember the exact date, but the late 70s, early 80s. So it's not a very old profession. And we did not need IBCLCs when everybody had breastfed because it was the only option. And so when you needed help, it was your sister, your mother, your auntie, your cousin who was helping you. But we
Yeah.
became so distant from breastfeeding as the biological norm due to a variety of factors, one of which being women entering the workforce during World War I and World War II and
I see.
needing other ways of feeding their babies, that we kind of lost that cultural knowledge. And so now there's not as much knowledge that we can pass down from one generation to the next, and we need people who can help us. Our relationships are also a little bit different. We live in a little more isolated social structures. So,
Mhm.
you're not living with your village who you feel comfortable somebody shoving your nipple into your baby's mouth. You might not be as close to your sister, your auntie, as maybe we were in the past. But I love hearing these stories of somebody whose primary baby feeding support person was somebody in their family or a close friend.
Yeah, as I said, we had a very close family growing up, and then that's continued, to this day.
Mm.
I just this past weekend, I was with my sisters, we were at my dad's, and then I went over, saw my mom. So, yeah, no, we're still going strong.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so the initial time was really difficult. How long do you think it took before you felt like, "Okay, I've got this?"
It was probably a couple weeks.
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
felt like it was a while.
that's not too
So
long, though. If you can get it nailed down in a few weeks, I think you're doing pretty good. And
oh, okay.
yeah, and did that pain, continue for some time, or did it seem to resolve pretty quickly? The nipple pain you experienced?
I think it resolved after I got used to it resolved, but just that first baby shock,
Mm.
um, but no, it resolved, it was good.
Okay, very good. And then did you feel like you had care providers, your pediatrician, for instance, who was supportive of breastfeeding? Did you ever get pressure to supplement, or did you have any weight gain concerns that you were dealing with any of your kids?
No, I mean, I wasn't I just remember my first couple pediatricians, I wasn't a fan. Uh,
Mm,
so they told me probably whatever they told me, I've just never paid attention.
mhm,
So but I would have to eventually supplement because then, especially with the first one, I went back to work full time.
mhm.
And not only that, where I lived and where I worked and where my daycare was just completely opposite
Oh
ways.
god.
So work was 30 minutes south. My in-laws had agreed to watch her, especially it being that young, 8 weeks,
Mm,
except they were 30 minutes north of
mm,
me. So I would drive then 30 minutes north to drop her off and then an hour in rush hour. So it really wasn't an hour. I mean, it was
mhm,
definition of insanity. So we ended up having to supplement, having to pump, a lot. And then eventually it got old pretty quick because as part of my job, I also traveled the country. Now
mm,
with Abby, I was still a pretty new attorney. So it was still very long hours, full
mm.
time traveling. So with her, unfortunately, breastfeeding did not last that long.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so for anyone who's in the thick of trying to make decisions about childcare and work and commuting and pumping, when you look back on those years of insanity, do you feel like there's anything that would have helped you to feel better in those moments, to feel less insane? Or do you just feel like it was something you had to get through because that's the way our work structure is, that we return at 8 weeks or 12 weeks when we're still brand new
You
parents?
know, no, in hindsight, I should have taken some more time off. Now, later in my years, I became more valuable. So by my third kid, I was the partner in the law firm. So when I went back, it was, I'm going to work at home most of the time. I'm going part time,
Mm,
whatnot. Um, so I had a lot more leniency and I obviously breastfed for a longer time. But being such a newer attorney, I was just so scared to get fired all the time.
right.
Back then, the jobs were, and I loved my job and I didn't want to lose it. And I was pretty new. So, I don't know, I wish I would have tried to extend my time off or go part-time,
Mhm,
something, but I was so on this mission to, become a partner, work hard, make build my reputation that I didn't, but now I've been in this for 21 years. I was a partner by, let's see, my son's 9. So as partner, at least by 10 years. I mean,
Mhm.
so what? Great. I've been a partner now for 11 years. Even so it doesn't matter. Even if I was just a partner for 8 years because I wanted to take some time off with my first one, I think that probably would have been more beneficial for her
Mm.
and for me. But, back then you're young and just trying to do what you know.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not really any working parent's fault that we don't have social structures that allow us to take the full postpartum time off. I mean, there are some studies that show it lasts up to 2 years, but we have to just rush back into
Mhm.
work if we want to maintain our professional lives, or many of us feel that way. And you're saying in hindsight, you would have probably met the same goals possibly on a longer timeline, but you
Mm.
can't know that in the moment. It feels
Right.
so urgent.
Right. Yeah. I
Yeah.
was always, even when I did go back to work with the last one, I mean, I still went back to work at 8 weeks. I just did it more part-time at my
Mhm.
house. So I still
Mhm.
went back to work,
You're
but
right.
again, not as much time and whatnot. But that one was, that's a lot easier. And then I also by then uh made more money. So
Mhm.
I
Right,
had people come into my home to
right.
watch my baby. So I would work at home, watch and then whoever was there, actually, it ended up being it ended up most of the time being my sister, who the
Mm,
one the one that loves kids and would
yeah.
help with the breastfeeding. She was a big part of that, and then there's been others, but yeah.
Yeah, so when you were working from home, were you pumping, or would she bring the baby to you to feed directly from the body because you were home, or was it a mix?
Oh, right, so directly I would breastfeed when I
Mhm.
was home.
Mhm.
I would
Yeah.
try to find work that I could do
Mhm.
while breastfeeding,
So, like,
so
reading
usually
cases or something like that?
right,
Mhm.
reading, usually deposition transcripts.
Mhm.
We have to read a lot. So,
Mhm.
I would
Yeah.
line that up. We'd
Yeah, that also takes some planning. I call this kind of work that we do mom math, or milk
yeah.
math,
Mhm.
because it does take a lot of extra energy to organize your day around feeding the baby or pumping, no matter which choice you're making if you have your baby while you're working.
Yep.
And then in your experiences when you were going into work, like with your first baby 20 years ago, tell me what it was like trying to find a place to pump while you were at work, how your employer was about giving you the time. Did you get as much time as you needed? Were they tracking for the billable hours? What was that like?
Hit that one on the nose. So it's billable hours. That's been the thing with my job. You
Mhm,
just have to bill so many hours by the end of the year, and whenever you can do it, you can do it. So, no, there was no extra time to breastfeed. I did have my own office. They put a lock on my door, so I
mm,
did have that.
okay.
So that was nice.
Yeah, and were you able to find time to pump while still accumulating your billable hours?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
'Cause it was, yeah. So I would again read. So it's like I'm
Mhm,
pumping, reading a deposition of something, and so I was able to bill that time because I was reading, so it'd be like usually if I'm reading a dep, I'm preparing for an expert deposition, reviewing their past testimony to get an idea of what they're gonna say in my case.
mhm,
So just prep for some expert testimony, and that
mhm.
was yeah, that's about the go-to billing.
Yeah. So milk supply is all about hormones. And when we have stress or fear hormones coursing through our body, then it kind of counteracts the milk releasing hormones. And I can imagine that while you were reading or doing work related to these really intense cases where people have injuries as a result of birth or death, that that could have had an impact on your milk supply. You can't help but feel something, or maybe you can once you've done it for so long. Maybe you should tell me abo when you're reading those cases, do you feel like that did have an impact, that kind of work, on your milk supply when you were away from baby?
I mean, I remember having once I went back to work that there was definitely less milk because then I had to start drinking more beer. So
Mm,
if the milk wasn't coming in, if I chugged a beer, I was great.
really?
So oh, it came right in. Let me tell you, it was like worked like a charm.
I've
So
heard people say, this is a common galactagogue we hear about, and there's not a ton of research on it, but was it dark beer that you drank? Because that's what I often hear people say, or
oh,
was it just
interesting.
anything?
Knowing me, it was just whatever was in the fridge.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But, I've gone to, from beer early days, whatever, to, wine drinking. So
Uh-huh.
now I'm like, "What did I drink?" I'm sure it's Corona. I
Uh-huh.
think it's
Right.
Corona Light. Uh, yeah, I think
Yeah.
that was it. But, these days, I definitely prefer wine over beer, so,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
it's hard to remember.
I'm
Um,
like
okay. You mentioned that you started formula at some point for supplementation. Do you remember how long it took before you needed to add extra supplementation? And did you continue producing as much milk as you could, or did you just fully switch?
it was always when I went back to work.
Okay.
So that's the supplement, and then like I said, yeah, definitely the milk supply once I started working would, decrease, hence the beer.
Mhm. And did you feel any sense of loss about transitioning to formula, or did it feel like it was just the best choice and you did the best you could?
Exactly. The best choice, best I could. So
Okay.
I was gonna go to work, so and then at that point too, even when you get to Liam at, my 3rd baby, at that point now, I'm not maybe working as much, but I got 2 girls
Mm.
that,
Mhm.
still needed a lot of attention. And I was like the Girl Scout leader. I was the baseball coach. We planned the homeroom party. Valentine's Day was like my homeroom party for the kids.
Mhm.
So yeah, I was still busy for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. And did you notice a big difference in technology, of breast pumps from your first to your third, or did they feel basically the same?
Oh, I think they felt the same.
Yeah, yeah. I have heard there's, a journalist who wrote a book called The Big Letdown about, um, the social and medical barriers to breastfeeding success, and she says this amazing there's this quote from the book. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but she says, "We can literally put men on the moon and breast pumps are like the same that they've been for like 60 years." Like, they really
Yep.
haven't changed. The mechanisms by which they get the milk out are still the same, even if they kinda look more fancy.
Yep. That's interesting. I like that quote.
Yeah, yeah, isn't that good? All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your baby feeding experiences. I think it's so important for people to hear just a wide variety of what happens and how people feel about what happens. And it's surprising how much we forget the things we do forget and then the things that stick with us even years later about those early experiences. So I appreciate you taking the time to share yours today on the Milk Making Minutes.
Aw, well, thank you for having me and allowing me to share my story. That was actually kind of fun.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Yeah, walk down memory lane.
Mhm.
But I'm not done having a conversation with you because we are going to continue to talk about the work that you do and how people can take the lessons you've learned, and put them in a really concise format and apply it to their own planning experiences. And that episode will release in 2 days. I told you there was a lot packed into this episode with Gina. I was so happy to have her as a guest. And if you want to hear her again talk about the lessons she's gleaned as a childbirth attorney for the last 20 years, then make sure that you have hit subscribe on whatever podcasting app you are listening to right now. That way, you get a little message that pops up that lets you know that the next episode has released. And speaking of that podcasting app, do me a big favor. Let me know that you are listening, that you appreciate the show, that it is a show that you would like to keep getting episodes of. How you do this is by giving it a review on whatever app you're on, and at the very least, rating 5 stars. Thanks so much.